In the spring of 1952, deep within the misty hollows of eastern Kentucky, a midwife named Opal Combs delivered a child whose hands would haunt her memories until her final breath. The baby emerged silent at first, and when his cry finally pierced the cabin's dim interior, Opal looked down at his tiny fists and felt her stomach turn. The infant's fingers were webbed together, skin stretched between each digit like the membrane of a bat's wing. She had seen many things in her 40 years of bringing children into these mountains, but nothing quite like this. The child belonged to the Hensley family, a clan that had inhabited the remote Wolfpen Hollow for nearly 6 generations. Their ancestors had arrived in these rugged hills sometime in the late 1700s. Seeking isolation from a world they never trusted, what they found was a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges accessible only by a single muddy path that flooded every spring. Here, the Hensleys built their dynasty of wooden cabins, each generation adding another structure to the compound that sprawled along the creek bed. But isolation, as history would reveal, came with a devastating price. The newborn was named Elijah after his grandfather and his grandfather before him. Names recycled through generations just like the bloodlines that produced them. His mother, Cordelia Hensley, was 19 years old and had married her first cousin, Harlan, 2 years prior. Their union had been arranged by the family patriarch, old Vernon Hensley, who believed that keeping marriages within the family preserved their land, their legacy, and their separation from what he called the corrupt outside world. Cordelia had known nothing else. Her own parents were second cousins, and her grandmother had married her mother's brother. The family tree of Wolfpen Hollow did not branch outward like most families. Instead, it folded back upon itself, roots and branches intertwining in a pattern that had repeated for over 150 years. When Opal Combs examined baby Elijah more closely, she discovered that his hands were not the only concern. His feet showed similar webbing between the toes, though less pronounced. His ears sat unusually low on his head, and his eyes, while bright and alert, were set slightly too far apart. She had heard whispers about the Hensley children before. Other midwives spoke in hushed tones about the babies born in that hollow, about the ones who did not survive infancy, about the others who grew into adulthood with twisted spines or minds that never quite developed properly. But Opal was a professional. She cleaned the baby, wrapped him tightly, and placed him in his mother's arms without comment. As she gathered her supplies to leave, old Vernon Hensley pressed $3 silver into her palm and leaned close to her ear. "What happens in this hollow stays in this hollow," he said, his breath smelling of tobacco and moonshine. "You understand me, woman?" Opal understood perfectly. She walked the 7 miles back to the nearest town and never spoke of what she had seen, at least not until 30 years later, when a county health worker came asking questions about the strange family in Wolfpen Hollow. The Hensleys were not unique in their practices. Throughout the Appalachian mountain region during the early to mid-20th century, isolated communities developed patterns of intermarriage that would shock modern sensibilities. Geographic barriers, poverty, distrust of outsiders, and fierce family loyalty combined to create pockets of genetic isolation that persisted for generations. But even among these communities, the Hensleys stood apart. Young Elijah grew up surrounded by relatives who shared his unusual features. His older sister, Bessie May, had been born 3 years earlier with a cleft palate that was never properly repaired. She spoke with a thick nasal voice that outsiders could barely understand. His uncle Horace walked with a severe limp due to one leg being significantly shorter than the other. His cousin Martha had been born without external ears, just small openings on the sides of her head covered by flaps of skin. These conditions were never discussed openly within the family. They were simply accepted as the way things were, the particular marks of Hensley blood that distinguished them from the outside world. Vernon Hensley had developed an elaborate mythology to explain these differences. He told the children that God had marked them as special, set apart from ordinary people for a divine purpose that would one day be revealed. But there was no divine purpose. There was only biology, ruthlessly expressing the consequences of a genetic pool that had grown dangerously shallow. By the time Elijah was 5 years old, it became clear that his mental development was progressing slowly. He did not speak his first word until nearly age 4, and even then, his vocabulary remained limited. He could perform simple tasks around the family compound, feeding chickens and carrying water. But he struggled to understand instructions that required more than one step. His mother, Cordelia, refused to acknowledge any problem. "He's just slow to warm up," she would say, when relatives commented on his delays. The Hensley men have always been the quiet type. The truth was far more complicated. Elijah's cognitive limitations were likely the result of the same genetic factors that had fused his fingers. When closely related individuals reproduce, they dramatically increase the chances that their offspring will inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes, one from each parent. These genetic disorders accumulate over generations, becoming more common and more severe with each successive intermarriage. The scientific understanding of these mechanisms was still developing in the 1950s. The structure of DNA had only been described by Watson and Crick in 1953, and the full implications of genetic inheritance would take decades more to unravel. The Hensleys, isolated in their mountain hollow, knew nothing of chromosomes or recessive traits. They only knew what they could see, that their children were different, and that the differences seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing generation. In the autumn of 1957, when Elijah was 5, a tragedy struck Wolf Pen Hollow that would begin to crack the family's wall of secrecy. Cordelia gave birth to her third child, a girl she named Rosemary. The baby appeared healthy at first, but within hours, her skin began to turn a troubling shade of blue. By morning, she was gone, her tiny heart unable to sustain the complex rhythms necessary for life. The local doctor who was summoned to examine the body, a young man named Dr. Thomas Whitfield, who had recently set up practice in the nearest town, noted several concerning observations. The infant showed multiple signs of what he suspected was a severe cardiac malf, for when he inquired about the family history, Cordelia became defensive, and Vernon Hensley ordered him off the property. But Dr. Whitfield was not soilly dismissed. Over the following months, he began making discreet inquiries about the Hensley family. What he discovered disturbed him deeply. Birth records such as they existed in that rural county showed a pattern of infant mortality in Wolf Pen Hollow that far exceeded any other area he had studied. Marriage records revealed the tangled web of consanguinity that connected virtually every Hensley to every other. He wrote a letter to the Kentucky Department of Health describing his concerns. The letter was filed and forgotten. One of thousands of reports that accumulated in government offices during those years, no one came to investigate. No one intervened. The Hensleys continued their isolated existence, and the consequences continued to multiply. If you've made it this far into this story, take a moment to check if you're subscribed to this channel. These hidden chapters of American history deserve to be told, and your subscription helps ensure these voices from the past are never forgotten. Hit that subscribe button now. The 1960s brought change to much of America, but the transformations barely touched Wolf Pen Hollow. While the outside world grappled with civil rights movements, space exploration, and cultural revolution, the Hensleys continued their centuries-old patterns of life and marriage. Elijah Hensley grew into adolescence, his webbed hands marking him as unmistakably different from the few outsiders he occasionally encountered. By the time he was 15, in 1967, his hands had developed as much as they ever would. The skin between his fingers remained thick and unyielding, limiting his grip and making fine motor tasks nearly impossible. He could not properly hold a pencil, button his own shirt, or perform dozens of other tasks that most people took for granted. But within the hollow, these limitations hardly mattered. Elijah was assigned work that suited his capabilities: chopping wood, hauling supplies, tending to the family's livestock. He was strong, if not quick-witted, and he found contentment in the simple rhythms of mountain life. He had never known anything different, and he could not miss what he had never possessed. His sister, Bessie May, had grown into a young woman of considerable practical intelligence. Despite her speech difficulties, she had learned to read from an old family Bible and had developed a keen understanding of herbal medicine, following in the tradition of Hensley women for generations. She gathered wild plants from the surrounding forests, gins, sang, and golden seal and bloodroot, which she dried and sold to traders who occasionally ventured near the hollow. But Bessie May carried a secret burden that she shared with no one. At age 16, she had been married to her Uncle Clyde, her mother's brother, a man 23 years her senior. The marriage had been arranged by Vernon Hensley, who was increasingly concerned about maintaining the family's isolation as the outside world crept ever closer to their mountain sanctuary. The union produced 2 children in quick succession. The first, a boy named Homer, appeared healthy at birth, but developed seizures by age 2 that left him with permanent brain damage. He would never walk or speak, spending his short life lying on a pallet in the corner of Bessie May's cabin. The second child, a girl named Pearlie, was born with a severe spinal curvature that left her hunched and twisted before she could even learn to stand. Bessie May nursed her children with fierce devotion, never questioning the hand that fate had dealt her. She had been raised to believe that suffering was simply part of life, that the Hensley family carried burdens that outsiders could never understand. She did not know that her children's conditions were directly connected to the tightening spiral of their family's bloodlines. The outside world, meanwhile, was beginning to take notice of isolated communities like Wolf Pen Hollow. President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty had identified Appalachia as a region requiring special attention, and federal programs began sending workers into the most remote areas of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Teachers, nurses, and social workers ventured into hollows and valleys that had been ignored for generations. In the summer of 1968, a young Vista volunteer named Margaret Sullivan was assigned to establish a literacy program in the county that included Wolf Pen Hollow. She was 24 years old, a recent college graduate from Ohio, who had been moved by the poverty she had witnessed during a spring break trip to the region. She had no idea what she was about to discover. Margaret's first encounter with the Hensley S came in August when she was walking a rarely used mountain path and became lost. As darkness approached, she stumbled upon the family compound and knocked on the door of the nearest cabin, seeking directions. The door was opened by Cordelia Hensley, now in her mid-30s, but looking far older. Years of hard labor, poor nutrition, and multiple pregnancies had aged her prematurely. Her face was deeply lined, her hair shot through with gray. But it was her hands that caught Margaret's attention. They were gnarled and twisted, the fingers bent at unnatural angles, clearly affected by severe arthritis. "You lost?" Cordelia asked, her voice flat and suspicious. Margaret explained her situation, and after a long moment of consideration, Cordelia invited her inside. The cabin was dim and smoky, lit only by a kerosene lamp and the glow of a wood-burning stove. As Margaret's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to notice the other occupants of the room. There was Elijah, now 16, sitting in a corner and staring at her with curious, unfocused eyes. His hands were folded in his lap, and even in the dim light, Margaret could see the webbing between his fingers. There was young Homer lying motionless on his pallet, making occasional involuntary sounds. There was Pearlie, her twisted spine evident even as she sat on a low stool by the stove. Margaret stayed for several hours, sharing a simple meal of cornbread and beans while making careful conversation with Cordelia. She learned about the family's history in the Hollow, their isolation from the outside world, their deep suspicion of government interference. She did not ask about the obvious physical conditions she observed, sensing that such questions would end her welcome immediately. When she finally left, guided back to the main road by a silent Elijah, Margaret's mind was racing. She had studied sociology in college and had read about isolated communities and their genetic consequences. But reading about such things in a textbook was entirely different from sitting in a cabin surrounded by the living evidence. Over the following months, Margaret made several more visits to Wolf Pen Hollow, always under the pretense of her literacy program. She brought books and supplies, offering to teach anyone who wanted to learn. Gradually, she gained the trust of some family members, particularly Bessie May, who was hungry for knowledge from the outside world despite her limited ability to communicate clearly. Through careful observation and patient conversation, Margaret pieced together the family's history. She learned about the generations of intermarriage, the high rates of infant mortality, the increasing prevalence of physical and mental disabilities. She documented everything in careful notes, unsure what to do with the information, but feeling compelled to record it. Her reports eventually made their way to state health officials, adding to the file that Dr. Whitfield had started a decade earlier. But again, no immediate action was taken. The political will to intervene in such communities was lacking, and the legal framework for doing so was unclear. The Hensleys were adults making their own choices. Officials reasoned, and their children, while disadvantaged, were not being actively harmed in ways that met the threshold for state intervention. What those officials failed to understand was that harm was being done, had been done for generations, and would continue to be done unless someone found the courage to break the cycle. The year 1969 brought another tragedy to Wolf Pen Hollow. Old Vernon Hensley, the patriarch who had enforced the family's isolation for decades, died of a massive stroke in October. He was 78 years old and had fathered 14 children by 2 wives, both of whom were his first cousins. Of those 14 children, only 8 had survived to adulthood. Of those 8, all showed some evidence of genetic conditions. Vernon's death created a power vacuum in the family. His eldest surviving son, Harlan, Elijah's father, was expected to take over as patriarch. But Harlan was a weak man, easily manipulated by his wife, Cordelia, and prone to bouts of heavy drinking. The family's iron discipline began to erode. It was during this period of instability that young Elijah, now 17, experienced his first meaningful contact with the outside world. Margaret Sullivan had arranged for him to visit a county health clinic, ostensibly for a routine checkup, but actually so that medical professionals could examine his webbed hands and assess his developmental delays. The examination was conducted by Dr. Robert Chen, a physician who had recently joined the clinic staff after completing his residency in pediatric genetics. What he observed in Elijah confirmed his worst suspicions about the family Margaret had described. The webbing of Elijah's fingers, Dr. Chen explained to Margaret afterward, was a condition known as synanpiquie. While it could occur spontaneously in any population, its prevalence increased dramatically in communities with high rates of consanguineous marriage. The condition was often accompanied by other genetic abnormalities, and in Elijah's case, Dr. Chen suspected there were additional chromosomal issues contributing to his cognitive delays. "This family needs intervention," Dr. Chen said, his voice heavy with concern. "If they continue on this path, the next generation will be even more severely affected." But intervention was easier said than done. The Hensleys wanted no part of the outside world's concern. The 1970s brought a reckoning that the Hensleys could no longer avoid. As medical understanding of genetic conditions advanced and public health programs expanded into the most remote areas of Appalachia, the family's secrets became increasingly difficult to maintain. In 1973, a mandatory school attendance law was enforced in the county for the first time. The Hensley children, who had always been educated informally within the family compound, were required to attend the county school. This prospect terrified Heron and Cordelia, who knew that their children would be immediately identified as different. The first day of school for 9-year-old Pearlie, Bessie May's daughter with the curved spine, was a disaster. The other children stared, pointed, and laughed. They called her names that she had never heard before, words that cut deeper than any physical pain she had experienced. She returned home in tears and refused to go back. But the law was clear, and truancy officers began making regular visits to Wolf Pen Hollow. Each visit increased the family's exposure to outside scrutiny. Social workers accompanied the officers, taking notes on living conditions and the health of the children. Slowly, painfully, the wall of secrecy that had protected the Hensleys for generations began to crumble. It was during this period that Elijah Hensley, now 21 years old, experienced something that would change his life forever. Margaret Sullivan, who had maintained contact with the family over the years, arranged for him to visit a specialist in Lexington who could evaluate his hands. The specialist, a reconstructive surgeon named Dr. Harold Freeman, believed that surgical intervention might partially separate Elijah's fused digits, improving his hand function significantly. The surgery was performed in March of 1974 for Elijah, who had never been more than 20 miles from Wolf Pen Hollow. The trip to Lexington was an overwhelming experience. The city's size, noise, and complexity left him dazed and frightened. But the kindness of the medical staff, particularly a young nurse named Sarah, who took time to explain everything to him in simple terms, opened his eyes to a world he had never imagined. The surgery was partially successful. Dr. Freeman was able to separate Elijah's middle and ring fingers on both hands. Though the index and pinky fingers remained fused to their neighbors, the improvement was modest but meaningful. For the first time in his life, Elijah could grip a cup properly, hold a fork, button his own shirt. More importantly, the surgery introduced Elijah to the concept that his condition was not divine punishment or family destiny. It was a medical issue with a medical explanation. Dr. Freeman, using simple language and diagrams, explained to Elijah how genetics worked and why families that married within themselves often produced children with health problems. This knowledge devastated Elijah. Everything he had been taught about his family, about their specialness, about God's plan for them, was revealed as a lie. His webbed hands, his sister's cleft palate, his niece's twisted spine, his nephew's seizures. All of these were the result of choices made by their ancestors, choices that were still being made by his relatives. When Elijah returned to Wolf Pen Hollow, he was a changed man. He could no longer look at his family the same way. He could no longer accept the isolation, the intermarriage, the perpetuation of suffering that had defined Hensley's life for generations. His transformation did not go unnoticed. Harlan, his father, sensed that something had shifted in his son. Cordelia watched Elijah with suspicious eyes, noting how he now flinched when relatives spoke of arranging marriages for the younger generation. The tension in the family compound grew thick and suffocating. In the summer of 1975, that tension finally exploded. Harlan announced that he had arranged for Elijah to marry his cousin Della, a quiet 16-year-old girl who was the daughter of his sister. The wedding was planned for the fall, following the Hensley tradition of keeping bloodlines pure. Elijah refused. The confrontation that followed was the most violent the Hollow had witnessed in decades. Harlan, drunk on moonshine and enraged by his son's defiance, attacked Elijah with a wooden stick. Elijah, stronger than his father, despite his limitations, defended himself, but refused to strike back. He simply absorbed the blows until his father exhausted himself. That night, Elijah packed his few possessions into a cloth sack and walked out of Wolf Pen Hollow forever. If this story is stirring something deep within your heart, leave a comment right now, saying, "Some chains are written in blood, but courage can break them." Let me know if you believe Elijah made the right choice. Elijah's departure sent shockwaves through the family. No Hensley had ever voluntarily left the Hollow. His act of defiance was viewed as the ultimate betrayal, a rejection of everything the family represented. Margaret Sullivan, who had become Elijah's lifeline to the outside world, helped him find work at a lumber mill in a town 40 miles from the Hollow. It was hard physical labor, but Elijah was suited for it. His improved hands, while still unusual, allowed him to grip tools well enough to do the job. He rented a small room above a hardware store and began building a life that his ancestors would never have recognized. The adjustment was brutal. Elijah struggled with tasks that others found simple. Reading was difficult, and numbers confused him. He was often cheated by merchants who recognized his limitations. He was lonely in ways he could not articulate, missing the only community he had ever known, even as he rejected everything it stood for. But slowly, painfully, he adapted. The nurse, Sarah, who had shown him kindness during his surgery, corresponded with him through letters that Margaret helped him read. In 1977, Sarah traveled to visit him, and something blossomed between them. She saw past his webbed fingers and slow speech to the gentle soul beneath. By 1978, they were married in a small ceremony that no Hensley attended. Back in Wolf Pen Hollow, the family continued its decline. Without Elijah's labor and without the sense of unity that opposition to outsiders had provided, the compound began to fracture. Harlan's drinking worsened. Cordelia grew bitter and withdrawn. The younger generation, exposed to the outside world through mandatory schooling, began questioning traditions their parents had never dared challenge. In 1979, Bessie Mae's son, Homer, finally passed away at age 14, never having spoken a word or taken a step. His death, while expected, devastated his mother. For the first time, she allowed herself to ask the questions she had always suppressed. Why had her children suffered so? Why had God marked her family with such burdens? The answers she found through conversations with the county health worker who had begun regular visits shattered her faith in everything she had been taught. She learned about genetics, about recessive traits, about the predictable consequences of consanguineous unions. She learned that her children's suffering had not been God's will, but the result of human choices made by her own family for generations. Unlike Elijah, Bessie Mae did not leave the hollow. She was too bound by responsibility, too limited by her circumstances. Her daughter Pearlie still needed care, and she could not abandon the only home she had known. But she made a vow to herself that the cycle would end with her generation. When her younger cousins spoke of marriages being arranged within the family, Bessie Mae spoke out against them. Her voice, still difficult to understand due to her cleft palate, carried the weight of authority earned through suffering. Some listened, others did not. The final chapter of the Hensley family story unfolded over the following decades. A slow dissolution of patterns that had persisted for nearly 200 years. Elijah and Sarah had 2 children together, both born healthy without any signs of the conditions that had marked the Hensley line. Elijah wept when he held his firstborn, a daughter they named Hope, and counted her perfectly separated fingers one by one. The curse, he realized, had never been a curse at all. It had been a consequence, and consequences could be avoided through different choices. He never returned to Wolf Pen Hollow, but he received occasional news through Margaret Sullivan. He learned that his father Harlan had died in 1982, his liver destroyed by decades of alcohol. He learned that his mother, Cordelia, had followed 2 years later, weakened by grief and chronic illness. He learned that the family compound was slowly emptying as the younger generations scattered to nearby towns, seeking opportunities their ancestors had rejected. In 1985, a team of medical researchers from the University of Kentucky conducted a comprehensive study of the remaining Hensley family members who agreed to participate. Their findings, published in a regional medical journal, documented one of the most extensive cases of multi-generational continuity ever recorded in the United States. The conditions observed included synandacty, cardiac malformations, cognitive impairment, skeletal abnormalities, and numerous other manifestations of recessive genetic disorders. The study brought unwanted attention to the surviving Hensleys. Newspaper reporters descended on the county seeking sensational stories about the Imberdad mountain family. Most of the family refused to speak with them, retreating further into isolation, but the damage was done. The Hensley name became synonymous with the darkest consequences of genetic isolation. Bessie Mae lived until 1991, caring for her daughter, Pearlie, until her own health failed. In her final years, she dictated her memories to a local historian who was documenting the region's oral traditions. Her account, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, provides the most detailed first-hand description of life in Wolf Pen Hollow during its final decades. "We didn't know any better," she said in one recorded session, her words transcribed phonetically to capture her distinctive speech. "Our people told us we was special, set apart. They told us outsiders would destroy us, but it was us destroying ourselves all along. Every baby born wrong, every child who died young, every one of us who struggled, it didn't have to be that way. Didn't have to be." Elijah Hensley lived until 2003, reaching the age of 51. He spent his final years in a modest home in eastern Kentucky, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, none of whom showed any trace of the conditions that had marked his own body. His wife Sarah said that he often spoke about his childhood in the hollow, not with bitterness but with a profound sadness for the suffering that could have been prevented. He wanted people to know, Sarah explained to a journalist who visited after Elijah's death. He wanted them to understand that isolation isn't protection, it's a prison, and the children are always the ones who pay the price. Today, Wolfpen Hollow is largely abandoned. The cabins that once housed generations of Hensleys have collapsed into piles of rotting timber, reclaimed by the forest that surrounds them. The creek still flows through the narrow valley, indifferent to the human drama that unfolded along its banks. Occasionally, hikers stumble upon the ruins and wonder about the people who once lived there. The story of the Hensley family is not unique. Throughout Appalachia, throughout America, throughout the world, similar patterns of isolation and intermarriage have produced similar consequences. The science is now well understood. The mechanisms clearly documented. We know that genetic diversity is essential for healthy populations, that the boundaries between family and marriage must be maintained for the well-being of future generations. But knowledge alone is not enough. The Hensleys possessed their own form of knowledge, a belief system that made perfect sense within its own framework. Breaking free from that system required courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty that few people possess. Elijah Hensley found that courage. He walked away from everything he knew, endured years of struggle and isolation, and built a new life free from the patterns that had imprisoned his family. His children and grandchildren live today as testament to his choice, their healthy bodies a monument to his bravery. Fused by the same blood, the Hensleys were born into a legacy they did not choose. But at least one among them found the strength to choose a different path. And in that choice lies hope for all who find themselves trapped by the circumstances of their birth. If you watched until here, it's because you truly connected with this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can meet you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel." If this story moved you, hit that like button to help more people discover these hidden chapters of American history. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about our past. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. This channel brings you the untold stories that history tried to bury, the families forgotten by time, the secrets hidden in the hollows and valleys of our nation. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the shadows of the past. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly past. It lives in our blood, in our choices, and in the stories we dare to tell.